So I noticed on the few times I've actually driven my Red 124 that when the fuel tank is around halfway, the fuel gauge bounces around a bit, and this can be caused by oxidation or varnish on the wires inside of the level sender. And if you're not aware, these white light switches, if you pull the stalk, it does actually turn it off for some long-term work in the rear without draining the battery. Removing this carpeting is achieved by just simply pulling down slightly these metal retaining hooks on the parcel shelf, and then the whole thing can just be pulled out. As easy as that. And that reveals our fuel tank. One electrical connector for the sender, and that just pulls straight off. And we just need some kind of giant driver to remove this massive nut. I have my 15-inch adjustable wrench, and that does the job perfectly in its maximum open state. This thing isn't overly tight. It does have a couple rubber O-rings to seal it. Optional if you want to replace those. Mine were in pretty good condition, so I didn't have to. You want to have a receptacle handy because this is going to make a mess when you pull it out. So the remainder of that nut can be pulled out by hand. And you can see the two O-rings, an inner and an outer. These are still fine. And then the sender just slides out when you get it on the correct angle. There's the perfect amount of clearance for it to come out with no troubles at all. The less fuel in the tank, the better when you do this, because, yeah, as you can see, some does come out of that sender. On my sender, there was this kind of sealant or glue on the shaft that was holding that slot nut in place. That was very easy to remove. Simply touching it with my needle nose pliers shattered it, so that's really not an excuse to not open it up. And we have a clear view of the slot nut now, once that sealant is removed. And all I used were some cheap lock ring pliers, and they fit into the slots perfectly on that nut and allowed me to unscrew it with ease. And then the whole thing just slides apart. The tube just removes in a downward direction. You want to be very, very careful doing this because the fine wires could be damaged easily, so take care and be very careful. And you can see the float coming out now. And that's all there is to it. There's the side resistive wires. And there is a contact at the bottom for the reserve light as well. My only issue was a flickering gauge in the middle position. I don't believe I have corrosion, it's more a varnish issue. So I'm going to go ahead and clean those wires with acetone. You can see the contacts on the float there, either side, gripping onto the wires. If you have serious oxidisation, you may need to clean those contacts as well. But if it's really bad, you're probably better off just replacing the whole thing. These are the cotton swabs I used, and that's the acetone I used, and quite a reasonable amount of varnish came off those wires. I have cleaned all surfaces of those wires. Not that it's easy to see on the camera because they are so ridiculously fine. They are much cleaner than they were. course, I like to test things before I put them back together. This is really hard to do while you're holding a camera at the same time. You want to move this very slowly up and down and make sure there's no intermittent connections or weird readings. So I did that just like this when I found a way of holding the camera at the same time. You want to see a smooth change in resistance, no jerkiness whatsoever, because that jerkiness or loss of connection is going to make your needle go haywire on your fuel gauge. That's what we're trying to avoid here. Now that I'm convinced that that's cleaned properly, I just have to reassemble it, and it's really quite easy. Definitely something you can do yourself if you're very careful with those wires, and if it is just varnish like in my case, you're pretty much guaranteed success with very minimal effort. And we'll just test it, make sure it still works. And sure enough, it works perfectly. So that's a successful repair as far as I'm concerned. Of course, the ultimate test is actually driving it around a bit when I've got a full tank and see how it performs around halfway. But I'm reasonably confident that is a fix, because the wires were definitely dirty when I first pulled that apart.